Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Attention Span Labs. I'm your host, Mike, and this channel is about whatever the hell I feel like talking about with regard to my hobbies, and lately we've been on a kick about comic books and superheroes. So today we're going to have another roundtable. Of course, accompanying me this evening is my wonderful wife, Shell Presto.
Howdy, folks.
And we also have a special guest, ArtAnon.
Howdy, folks.
And today we're going to talk about how we got into comics briefly, why we liked comics, particularly the big two, and why none of us are buying them today. So, ArtAnon, you're our special guest to this channel. Would you like to start?
Okay, I think my introduction to comic books was the Hanna-Barbera Fantastic Four or Space Ghost or Johnny Quest cartoon. One of those three. I really didn't realize that comic books existed until after I had seen those shows, and then found myself inside of a drugstore where I saw the Fantastic Four in a Marvel Collector's Item Classics, and said, well, hey, that's what I was watching on the TV, so I had to pick a copy up, and Jack Kirby fan instantly from that point on. But also a quick introduction, obviously, to Iron Man, the Don Heck story with the Black Knight, a slice of Hulk #1, and a Steve Ditko Doctor Strange. It was a great intro to Marvel Comics, and then that became an interest for me to track down a number of these superheroes. Found out that there was another company called DC. Found out there were also things like Gold Key Comics, Dell Comics, a lot of companies that aren't around anymore. Some of them have been republished. IDW, Image, have pulled a few of those into their republishing lines. So that was my start.
So, Mike, you or me next?
You go next, Shell.
All right. I got into superheroes in general when I was a really young kid. I watched both the 60s and 80s Spider-Man cartoons. Was there a 60s one? I think there was.
Yes,
anyway,
there was.
I watched both the 60s and 80s Spider-Man cartoon and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and I watched the Superman movie a lot. But I didn't realize comic books were a thing until in the early 1990s, 1993, when the X-Men cartoon came out. And I jumped headlong into X-Men. I immediately got into collecting back issues too, so I started reading like reprints of the earlier comics right off the bat, and that's the place where I started.
Okay, so just so we're keeping track, ArtAnon's talking about the 60s, Shell's talking about the early 90s. I'm the same age as Shell. I'm a few months older than her, but I got into them comic books themselves somewhat earlier, probably, than I could actually read. But like both ArtAnon and Shell, I first got into it through cartoons. I was a fan of course, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends with Iceman and Firestar in the 1980s. I really liked that show, and also would watch reruns of the Super Friends, and that's how I was introduced to the DC characters like Batman, Superman, of course. But the first comic I got was in 1987, and I remember this very specifically because I was actually still living at my grandmother's house with my parents lived with my grandparents at the time, and we had not yet bought our new house. And so this would be 1987. It was an issue of G.I. Joe Special Missions. I don't remember the number, but it had Lifeline stuck in a parachute, like hanging from a tree while the October Guard passed underneath him on the cover. And I couldn't yet read at the time. I guess I was 3 going on 4 years old. And but my mom or my dad read it to me, and I was a big G.I. Joe fan. and I continued getting the G.I. Joe issues through the 80s and in the 90s. And then very early in the 90s, I was my dad, who actually worked on the garbage truck, when he would walk past the news store, or the news agency, we called them. See, back then there were comic book stores, but there weren't. There
that wasn't the only place to get them.
Right, you got them at was mentioned previously. You got them at the gas station, you got them at the convenience store, you got them at the drugstore. But he would bring home comics for me, Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man especially, and they were the first ones that I can remember reading myself. And then around the same time, 1991, I started getting into he would buy the trading card packs, the Marvel Superheroes, Marvel Universe Series 2 cards. They're the first ones I had, and then that is when my explosion of interest really got into with all the characters, and I realized there was this huge universe with all these characters in it, particularly Marvel, less so DC. But from then I continued on and off for another 20 plus years. So I think one thing we all shared is this early exposure to things that were actually not comic books that introduced the characters to it, but yet that got us interested in it. And so, for a number of years we went on reading, but then something happened. And I would say, I dare say, in my case, certainly it was not simply that I grew up and stopped reading comic books because I thought they were for kids, and we'll hear what you guys think. But there were very definite periods of my life where I was just I was unhappy with comics, and maybe we should get into that next. ArtAnon, do you wanna go again?
Sure. I think the period of time that I enjoyed reading comic books was, again, as you alluded to, kind of like the late 80s through the early 70s. At the same time I was reading comic books, I was very interested in animation. So I was watching a lot of cartoons. Hanna-Barbera, up until about 1968, 69, had some of the best action cartoons around, and the reruns of those cartoons were pretty prevalent for a number of years. But action for children's television that kind of came on after the assassination of Robert Kennedy eliminated a lot of those cartoons. It sort of created a kind of an adventure cartoon desert. At the same time that I'm watching animation, I was also reading a lot of pulp. Doc Savage, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, science fiction, Andrea Norton, Heinlein, you name it. I was absorbing it. I was just loving this stuff. I was grinding through a lot of novels growing up, and I think the comic books were kind of coming a little more slowly because I grew up on a farm out in the middle of the Midwest. So much like you said, we didn't have comic stores. In fact, I don't think there were any comic stores unless you were going into one of the major metropolitan areas. So drugstores, grocery stores, you'd pick up 4-packs of Marvel comics. I think that's where we got our first, set of non-collector's item classics floppies. I remember my first X-Men comic was X-Men 43 with Magneto on the cover, and that was just a ripping good story with that backup story. Shell, you know which one I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Those kind of things just kind of got me hooked. But DC was doing something similar. I remember picking up Adventure Comics 367 with the Dark Circle as my first Legion story, with Kurt Swan doing just some bang up art in that story. I just couldn't believe that there was this team of 20-some superheroes that I hadn't heard about before. So there were these little things that were popping up right in the heart of this era where so many characters were created. I mean, this was kind of like the tailing off of the Kirby Ditko creation phase. I mean, they generated, and Mike, you've alluded to, I think in a video before, that they just had this incredible creation of characters and themes from about 1961 to 1967, 68. And I couldn't believe that there was all this stuff out there. I was just amazed by it. You started seeing, though, after about 1969, at least I did, that the quality started falling off. And I didn't realize at the time, but a huge proliferation of comic books just started showing up. And I didn't get why some of these were popping in, because they just didn't seem to have a lot of draw. Not like the core Marvel or core DC books. But from about 1970, 71, 72 and forward, you just had a proliferation of titles. And that was the first time I saw titles die off. These new titles, they'd pop up for maybe about 20 issues, 30 issues, but then they'd go away. So that's really kind of, I think, when I started falling off too. I started, drifting away from comic books. X-Men was one of my favorite comic books, and when it stalled out at 66, and then when there was kind of a real shakeup with the Avengers, I track it right around to when Hank Pym became Yellow Jacket, and Yellow Jacket married the Wasp. Don't ask me why, but that's when the Avengers went away.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned like 1968. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was around the time that that Marvel was able to print as many titles as it wanted, because in Marvel's early run, they were owned by someone else, or they're contracting with some distributor that only allowed them to print like 6 or 8 titles, and then after that, they eventually were successful enough to get out from that. And then actually, it was probably DC that was distributing them, if I know this story correct.
Well, DC offered to distribute them, but Marvel refused,
Okay.
which was interesting because Warner, I don't think it was under Warner, but National Publishing at that point, didn't want Marvel to go away. They thought the competition was actually pretty healthy, because they shared a few artists and shared a few writers, and they would rib each other quite a bit. If you go back to Not Brand Eck from Marvel and the Inferior Five from DC, you saw that they had no problem with poking fun at each other. And while it may not have gone up to the editorial or senior management level, it was certainly there at the writer and artist level. They enjoyed doing that. And I think you're familiar too with the fact that Marvel was sold in 1968 as well.
Right.
And one of the reasons that I learned not too long ago, maybe a couple of years ago, that you saw that proliferation of titles was the new owner saw the potential with the cartoons as well as other marketing that, we need to get more books out there. So at that point in time is where you saw Tales of Suspense split off into Iron Man 1 and Captain America 101 or 100. I'm not sure which one it was. I think it was 100.
Yep.
Tales to Astonish did the same thing. Journey of Mystery was still Thor. Strange Tales became Doctor Strange, and Nick Fury got his own comic book. So a lot of these titles that can they handle their own book? In many respects, they were split regardless whether or not they could. There's arguments as to whether or not Doctor Strange and Nick Fury could handle their own book. Submariner could handle his own book. I think over time we've seen, no, they really can't. They're not that popular a character in many cases. But that was the push, is to get as many books out there as possible. And there was also the advent of a lot of the Marvel horror comics, reprints of the old Strange Tales, Journey into Mystery, when they were monster comics. They had the Kirby and Don Heck and Steve Ditko 5-pagers that were usually the backups to other stories, or sometimes there were just one of 5 or 6 stories in an anthology in those books.
Shell, do you want to go next and to talk about where you started to fall out of love with your daily or your weekly comics habit?
Yeah. So I started reading comics heavily in 1993. I actually started to drop off actually, this is an inaccurate statement, because I didn't fall out. There's never a point in my life when I wasn't reading comics. I dropped out of American comics and started to pretty heavily in 2000. So I lasted in there 7 years. The thing that really now nowadays crossovers irk me in a completely different way than they used to irk me back then, because I started reading comics right smack in the middle of the Phalanx saga or Phalanx Covenant. So I entered comics on a big crossover event. But back then, even if a comic was in a crossover, it usually had a full beginning, middle, end. So that didn't bother me. I could jump into crossovers all day and still have a good time with a single issue. But around 2000, that was when the Apocalypse was coming back as a villain. They were making Cyclops the next vessel of Apocalypse. And really at that point, I just felt like I was pretty let down by Onslaught, because that was the first time that it felt like the writers were doing something just to be contrary. In the early 90s, they set up this thing where Bishop came back from the future, and he said one of the X-Men betrayed them, and he thought it was Gambit, and it was this whole thing. And then they had the Onslaught thing, and Onslaught was part
Professor
of
X.
Well, it was part of Magneto's consciousness, kind of chipping away at Professor Xavier's subconscious. So then Professor Xavier became the big villain. And even though the writing
Subverted expectations.
Yes.
As our friend Ryan Johnson would say.
And it was just one of those things where it's like, it wasn't that the writing was bad. It wasn't that the characters were out of character. It just struck me as you're doing this specifically because you were trying to pick the biggest surprise you could. Oh, Professor Xavier's the bad guy. And Professor Xavier had shown some, we'll say, morally questionable behavior in the past. I mean, he's a telepath. He's wiped people's minds. He reads people's minds. Just that is a sort of violation on a level that, someone reading your thoughts is just wrong on so many levels. But that started a real kickoff of making Professor Xavier a villain, and it would keep popping back up when I later got in and hopped out again too. So then when they were doing Apocalypse is back and now Cyclops is going to be a villain, and I was like, I want my heroes to be heroes. I know that, you have the storylines every once in a while where, the hero's mind controlled or turns into a bad guy, or Lord knows Dark Phoenix Saga, I think, is one of the best stories ever, and that's about a hero becoming a villain. But it just started to feel heavy, and I wanted something more entertaining and more lighthearted. So I got into anime and manga when I was 13 and 14. So that was around, doing math in my head,
1996, 1997.
Yeah, 1997, we'll say. So when American comics failed me, I just slipped right into manga, and Japanese comics were the only thing I read for a long time. I did slip back into comics. I was taken by surprise in 2006. I found the Joss Whedon Astonishing X-Men in the library as a graphic novel, and I picked up the first book, and it was really good. Joss Whedon seemed like he liked the John Byrne, Chris Claremont, Paul Smith, and Dave Cockrum era of X-Men the way I did. So that felt refreshing and familiar. And the funny thing is, they told Joss Whedon he didn't have to take into account any other things going on at the time. They said, when you finish your storyline, we'll essentially reboot the rest of the X universe to say what you had happen. So he didn't have to pay attention to any of the other books, which was great. So then I got back into comics from 2006 to about 2009. There were some issues here and there with Joss Whedon's writing, but he took a lot of things that Grant Morrison set up that I absolutely hated, and he kind of smoothed them over, put some icing on them, set a lampshade on them, and I was okay with them at that point. But after he left and I jumped back into the X universe as a whole, they were doing again, Professor X is a villain, Cyclops is a villain, not everyone's very heroic, and often you couldn't pick up a single issue and get a whole story. So I started to get lost, I started to lose interest, and the two biggest factors for me was actually during Avengers Initiative, I liked the new team of kids they brought on, and after 12 issues, they immediately killed half the team and sent the kids to other books, and then I didn't know what book to go into. And then right around then too, they did Secret Invasion, and I was reading and enjoying Peter David's X Factor at the time, and X Factor, I guess, was selling better than She-Hulk, or neither of the books were selling well enough to essentially do a crossover. I don't know if they didn't print enough issues or what, but I couldn't get the issue of She-Hulk that crossed over for Secret Invasion, and they had something really important happen in there to the X Factor characters, and it felt like Marvel was doing a big crossover like every year, and it was really interfering with the stories, and I said, you know, screw that, I'm out. So that's when I hopped out again, probably around 2009-ish, 2010-ish.
Yeah, and my experience mirrors Shell's pretty closely. I had two falling outs with Marvel. Understanding, as I said before, that I was hugely into them. I mean, I bought titles that I didn't even like because I was enthralled with the idea of this shared universe, which of course still enthralls me to this day.
I was going to say, doesn't Ascension Epoch feel like one of those?
Yes, absolutely. Except with the Ascension Epoch, of course, is our series that we have collaboratively built. But the difference there is that I actually like all the titles in the Ascension Epoch. But I would occasionally buy stuff from stuff I wasn't, I'd occasionally buy an Alpha Flight issue, or I wasn't big into Silver Surfer back then when I bought, or Guardians of the Galaxy, back when Guardians of the Galaxy was still set in the 31st century. But anyway, 95, 96, when they did the Clone Saga, I was a huge Spider-Man fan, and I got into it, and I was skeptical at first, but I actually really liked Ben Reilly's clone, who they said at first was the real Spider-Man, but then they're like, no, it backfired on them, and then they're like, no, he was the clone all along. But I liked Ben Reilly, and I liked the transition because they allowed Peter Parker to continue being Spider-Man. Like, Ben Reilly didn't take his identity, even though he was supposed to be the original guy. And Peter went on to live with, a normal life with Mary Jane, have a kid supposedly, and he kept a costume and everything. And Ben was the new Spider-Man. He got into New Adventures, and I liked that because I thought it respected the character. And I know some people it respected the old character, but also the new character is very interesting. And I know people will disagree with that. But I liked that. And then I really disliked when they backtracked on it. When I guess it was right after Onslaught or during Onslaught or something like that. Like, oh, no, he was, Ben was the clone all along, and he has to die now, and all this other stuff. And then Onslaught, of course, because more than anything else in the Marvel universe, I was a fan of the Avengers. And of course, what happened in Onslaught was the Avengers Fantastic Four, basically all the non-mutant superheroes except for Spider-Man and Hulk got shunted to an alternate universe that they were going to relaunch with the talents of Rob Liefeld and some other Image people that they had, that they didn't want anything to do with a few years earlier. And I didn't like that because, as I just said, I was very much into the shared universe, and I began to feel the first of many betrayals of that there, and then relaunching, and then that didn't work. So they relaunched all the titles at #1. And then that was 97, 98. That was a failure. So they brought all the heroes back. And I say failure, but they probably intended it all along, because Marvel was in bankruptcy at this time, or close to it. And they knew #1 issue sold. So they relaunched brought the heroes back and relaunched them all in 98 with the Heroes Return. there's a 2-year period there where I wasn't buying comics, and then in '98 I got back in, and I liked it at that time, but they would very shortly go on to de-emphasize continuity between titles, as Shell mentioned before, and I thought that was that really hampered my enjoyment of it, and I thought that they were kind of being cheap and lazy writers, and or even that the editors weren't doing their job. So I was only stuck around for another year or two there. Then I dropped out again until after I graduated college. I first got back into it with Ultimates, because Ultimates is an alternate universe title, but I said, you know what, if they're trashing all the characters and their backstory and shaking up continuity anyway, I might as well read an alternate history story and get in from the ground level. And I liked it. And then I got back into the mainstream Marvel universe right at the time of Civil War. I really disliked Civil War. I disliked the fact that, of course, I was a Captain America partisan, and I'll always root for superheroes against the government. But I really resented the fact that Captain America had no plan. The writers had no plan, and they Marvel. And this is sort of the first obvious signs that the.
Can I hop in?
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to say to really hit home what Mike's talking about there. There's in the climax of Civil War, Captain America makes a stunning plan to get all the captured heroes out of prison.
And it worked.
And it worked, and they're fighting outside in New York. And they win. And Captain America just looks around him like he has never seen a war before, and like he has never been in a fight. And he's completely gobsmacked, and all of a sudden he turns sad, and he says, I didn't realize that we were going to be fighting our friends and that there was going to be violence. He doesn't say it in those words, but it really, truly does just ring like, what character is this?
Every issue of the previous 30 years in real life was them tearing up New York, and all of a sudden he feels really bad about it.
And more than that, he just he acts like he's never been in a war and he didn't have a plan. And Captain America's thing is he's the quintessential leader. He always has a plan. So if he doesn't know, if this was part A and B of his plan, and he doesn't have a C, D, E, and F, and a backup C, D, E, and F, and another backup C, D, E, and F, that's not Captain America. And it was just a really, really lazy climax on the story. Continue.
If I can jump in on that too, that's exactly where a lot of my fracturing away from reading mainstream comics came from as well. Things like exactly what you're talking about with Captain America. I'm not sure what issue it was, because again, during the 90s, I was just I would pop in occasionally to see what was going on, because I pretty much gave up collecting new stuff during the 80s, and I was backfilling my 1960s collection during those years. But when I would pop in, there was one issue of Captain America where he's fighting a series of terrorists. One of the terrorists is gunning down some people, I believe, in a church. His shield is across the room. He picks up an automatic weapon and kills the terrorist, and then has a crisis of faith. This is a man who went through World War II, and as Steve Rogers has probably killed a lot of Germans.
Absolutely.
It made absolutely no sense. A lot of what you guys are talking about is that headcanon. Does this make any sense? I'll go back to Today Stewart's fan fiction. It felt like fan fiction. What Captain America are we talking about here?
Right. I actually had that. I didn't read it at the time, but years later when I bought the trade paperback for Maximum Carnage, that's one where there were 5 Spider-Man titles at the time, believe it or not, every month. And then for each of those for like 6 months. So there was like 30 issues or something like that. All these titles crossed over in this one super crossover arc, and Carnage and his band of actual they're so bad that Venom joins Spider-Man and the superheroes to try and kill Carnage, or try and defeat Carnage anyway. And there's they send it up at the authors explicitly made it as sort of this rebuke of the Iron Age, that killing is never okay in comics, and that actually people like the Punisher and Wolverine are bad, and they sort of juxtapose Carnage there, even though Carnage was like was murdering people as opposed to maybe, you know, arguably killing people that deserve to die, or whatever your position on that is. That was their argument. But they did it really badly, just like they did Civil War, in that they would beat this ever-growing band of superheroes, Spider-Man, Black Cat, Venom,
Iron Fist,
Iron Fist, Captain America, Firestar, Deathlock, Cloak and Dagger, right? And I mean, Carnage and his crew are really racking up a huge death count. Not only that, but one of their villainous allies, Shriek, is able to like make everybody in New York really malicious and murderous towards each other. So
yeah,
they're
like
also
they had like moments where like a mother was thinking of killing her baby, like it was that bad.
It was like Kingsman, like the end of the first Kingsman movie, if you've seen that, right? So sort of
right.
And there's several times where they nearly kill Carnage, and there's a part where Firestar is blasting him, and she has him down, right? And then she lets off because she's like, oh, I don't want to kill him. And then Venom and Black Cat are like, you're crazy, you got to kill him. And Spider-Man's like, no, yeah, they're right, you got to kill him. And so then she's like, well, if Spider-Man's telling me to do it, it must be okay. Which is kind of like a moral abdication. But
yeah, right.
Anyway, so she's like, okay, I'm going to kill him. And she's killing him. And then Peter Parker is like, oh, what am I doing? This is wrong. You can't kill Carnage. And of course, it's a bad decision. He immediately escapes and he goes on like in the next page to murder like an elderly couple in their car.
Right.
And then later on, they have this crisis where the superhero team breaks up, like the lethal heroes like Venom are like, basically you're too soft, right? And this is getting people killed. And frankly, they're right. But anyway, Captain America shows up. And Captain America, of course, is the moral center of the Marvel universe. So when Cap says, I think you need a hand, and you're doing the right thing by not killing anybody. And it's frankly impossible to believe that Captain America, who fought in World War II, who fought in every theater of World War II, canonically, must have killed Germans, Japanese, Italians, Bulgarians, whoever the hell, right? By the hundreds.
Right.
And all of a sudden he knows, and he's seeing, and it's one thing, it's quite one thing to say, you know, I have someone beaten, I have them captured, I'm not going to torture them. That's intrinsically wrong to do that. Okay. But when you're like, I have to stop this person because I know if I don't, they're going to go on kill you. You have a moral, I personally believe a moral requirement that you have to kill them.
Right. Not to cut you off, but I'm gonna jump in when you're done. Dark Knight. Don't let me forget that. Dark Knight.
Okay. So, but you just to go back to the Civil War thing. To get back on track, but the same thing happened again. It was a disaster, and I kind of lost interest, but I kept going on until 2011, which is, you know, the year Shell and I got married, and we were actually it was actually when we were on our honeymoon where I bought my last weekly run of Marvel Comics, and it was during the Fear Itself storyline, and that was really dumb. And it was obviously, as Shell mentioned before, every year they were having another crossover. And every year the stakes were just right again. And they were just, all they were doing with these crossovers was undoing the previous crossover.
The other thing about the crossovers is they've grown to a point, like it used to be, if there was, say back in the day when they did Inferno, it was mainly the X books. You were buying other X books. You knew the characters in the X books. If, you know, Daredevil or the Avengers had a little part in Inferno, it was literally a short standalone story that you didn't have to read the other books to understand. Right. And crossovers have grown to a point now where it's like you need to buy every other title. So there were points where you're like, I have to buy 52 extra comic books this year if I want to know what was going on.
Yeah, Civil War had something like 60 close to 70 tie-ins. And that was
well,
impossible.
They had the weekly comic, and then they also had tie-ins in every existing comic.
And
Continue.
at $3 an issue, that's a lot of money for the average kid in America to shell out that much money for a story that is a reboot universe. And
Yes.
and that's another point I want to come back to as well.
Okay, that's where we're going to cut off part 1 of this sprawling discussion on what we liked, what got us into comics, and what we didn't like, and what got us out of reading mainstream comics. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, if you feel similarly to us, I would really encourage you to check out our website at heroicadventurefiction.com. There you can read some of our stories completely for free, and other ones you can follow on week by week as we add new chapters. And there you can also buy our books and patronize us. If you feel the same way we do about comics, we think you'll really like our Ascension Epoch shared universe, and we hope you will check that out. But please join us next episode while we continue this discussion, where we talk about, amongst other things, continuing crossover fatigue, why Marvel seems to hate marriages and stable romantic relationships with its characters, and what the hell is Batman doing by letting the Joker live all this time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and perhaps most importantly, share it with your friends, share it on social media, email it to someone that you think may like it, and please let us know in the comments what your thoughts are. What did you, how did you first get into comics? What were your favorite titles? And if you've fallen out of love with comics, let us know why. Thanks again for watching. This is Mike for Attention Span Labs, signing off.